Hello, and welcome to our talk show, A Drink with the Past, featuring your host,
Martin.
and Jose. On this day, we're going to be taking a leap into all things Martin Luther King Jr., scoping from his lore, through his policies that he was a part of during his legacy, through the civil rights movement, to keeping up with honoring his legacy after his death. Our drinks for this episode include a very simple Stella Rose Red Berry wine.
Jose, if you wouldn't mind.
Say when. Alright, so settle in and toast with us as we take a drink
With
with the past and with Martin Luther King Jr. You know what? I agree with the saying on it. It says it's semi-sweet. Let me put a little more.
There you go.
So,
there you go. Drink it up, drink it all up, drink it all up.
You want some more? Okay, so what do you remember as far as Martin Luther King?
Honestly, it was like not too much. I mean, like I think in elementary it was just like in elementary I think we didn't really get too much into it. All we know was like, oh, you guys got a free day on the third Monday, right? It was like, oh, you guys don't have school, you get a 3-day weekend. And in middle school we kind of got talking to it a little bit. But like probably like either in an English class or like in a history class, we just talked like a little bit about it because and in high school it's like that's when we really got into it, especially in our U.S. history class. That's when we really got deep into
Sure, definitely.
Martin Luther King Jr.
Definitely.
And I think also in our government class too we talked about it because of the rulings that took place and everything, right, that had to do with government. So I mean, all I really know was like, oh, MLK Day, oh, that's a 3-day weekend, and then like basically,
I honestly, the only thing I remember was segregation. Then Martin Luther King came around, and then obviously that was not an issue anymore. The end. That was it.
basically that's how it was, right? It's like, oh well, we know about segregation, right, about the Jim Crow South, right, the Civil War, right, the fighting to end slavery, and of course the Reconstruction era where the northern troops were stationed in the South to make sure the Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th amendments were being fulfilled in the South, etc. And then, of course, you had the almost a century of Jim Crow laws justifying the segregation between white Americans and black Americans from facilities, right? So, and then Martin Luther King comes along, right, in the 60s, and of course he and many others, not just black Americans, but also white Americans, Latino Americans, right, from all walks of life, they came and they started crying for more civil rights, more civil liberties in the United States, to be treated more as equal. But unfortunately, right, back in those days, it would have been viewed as like a different thing, especially by like, white conservative Americans who were on full segregation. So I mean, that's really what I remembered out of it.
Okay. So how did he get here?
Well, first of all, we gotta know about who Martin Luther King Jr. was, right? So first of all, he was a social activist and a Baptist minister who did play a role in the American rights movement, like the key role in it, until his assassination in 1968. And of course, his goal was to seek equality and human rights for African Americans, the economically disadvantaged, and all victims of injustice through peaceful protest. So he was all about peaceful protests, and he would also be the driving force behind like the Montgomery bus boycott, and then his famous March on Washington in 1963, in which that march helped bring the landmark legislation of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act into play, like into effect. And then he would eventually be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he is remembered every year on the day, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which became a federal holiday since 1986. And it's every third January. Every third Monday of January. Yeah.
Okay.
Every third Monday of January.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's also. It's nice to know that there is someone in the past that, was able to stand up not just for, you know, the economically disadvantaged, but it also, sparked an inspiration for, everyone that obviously is not white that had, had to face certain struggles, including with slavery as well, but also just, not being treated equally, as so mentioned, being here in America at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, so the thing is, Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, 1929, which it was a couple of days ago, on January 15th, in Atlanta,
Happy belated
Georgia.
birthday.
Happy belated birthday. And he was born in Atlanta, Georgia. So he and his family have always been natives of the South, like Black Americans, native to the South. And he was basically the second child of Martin Luther King Sr., who was also a pastor, and Alberta Williams King, who was a former school teacher. And he did have an older sister, Christine, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel Williams. And of course, his neighborhood that he grew up in, it was called Sweet Auburn, right? It's in Atlanta, a neighborhood in Atlanta. And it was then home to some of the most prominent and prosperous African Americans in the country. So
Okay.
there was success. So it was a neighborhood where very successful and prominent African Americans did live, right? Even though it is the segregated Jim Crow South, they were still very prominent.
Okay. Anywho, so what happened after that?
Well, of course, King obviously attended segregated public schools, right? Since living in the South, all schools were segregated. So, of course, he had the experience of having attended a segregated school. And at the age of 15, he was actually admitted to the Morehouse College at the age of just 15, which was the
Interesting.
which was the alma mater of both his dad and maternal grandfather, where he studied medicine and law.
Medicine? I actually didn't know that.
So, although he had not intended to follow in his dad's footsteps by joining the ministry, he changed his mind under the mentorship of Morehouse's president, Dr. Benjamin Mays, all right, who was an influential theologian of the time, right? And after graduating in 1948, King entered Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he earned a Bachelor of Divinity degree, won a prestigious fellowship, and was elected president of his predominantly white senior class.
Interesting. But that was probably
This was in Pennsylvania.
I was gonna say, like, this is not in Atlanta, Georgia, where I don't think it would have been possible at that time to be top of his class,
No, white class. Yeah, so he did see the difference, obviously. Especially a lot of Black Americans who travel to the northern states, right, from the South, they do see a huge difference in just the atmosphere and basically how they are viewed by white Northerners. So
Okay.
I mean, a president, him being elected president of his predominantly white senior class, like that, I feel like that was like a major like feat for him.
Definitely.
So King enrolled in a graduate program at Boston University, and in 1953 he earned his doctorate in systematic theology. He completed his coursework in 1953 at Boston University, and then 2 years later he got his doctorate in systematic theology. So basically in 1955. And while
Yeah, do the math.
yes, and do the math. So while in Boston, he met Coretta Scott, who was a young singer from Alabama who was studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. And of course, one thing led to another, and they ended up getting married in 1953 and settled in Montgomery, Alabama, where King would become the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. So I
Okay.
mean, that's a nice story. You know, they met. She and his wife met in Boston, right?
Uh huh.
And they tied the knot in '53.
Okay.
And of course, they ended up having four children.
Four.
Yeah, four children: Yolanda Denise, Martin Luther King III, Dexter Scott, and Bernice Albertine.
Okay.
So,
Good to hear.
so
So you mentioned there was a boycott going on that he was a part of. What was that all about? The oh, it was the Montgomery bus boycott.
yeah, the Montgomery bus boycott, exactly. So, um, he was involved in it, but like it, but the way how it played out, right? Why it started, it goes back to another special person that had a big role in the civil rights movement, and that person was Rosa Parks, right? Who was the secretary of the local chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is known as the NAACP, right? So she ended up sitting. So in Alabama, like in other southern states, the bus was basically segregated, right? So whites sat in the front, blacks sat in the back, right?
Uh huh.
So Rosa Parks decided to challenge that, right? She wanted to challenge that rule to see like how the reaction would be like, right? So she ended up refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger on the Montgomery bus and would be arrested for it, right?
Okay.
And activists coordinated a bus boycott that would continue for basically like a year, like almost like a year, like over a year, right?
Uh huh.
And basically, the Montgomery bus boycott placed a severe economic strain on the public transit system and downtown business owners, right? And so the NAACP chose Martin Luther King Jr. as the protest leader and official spokesman. So that's how he got into like the role of playing for desegregating in the South, and like basically, um,
So it started
yeah,
there. Did it start there, um, or was it just something that happened while he was trying to like break desegregation?
so it did start in Montgomery. Like, yeah, there was segregation attempts everywhere, right? But before we get into like talking about Black Americans, right? So desegregation for Black Americans, we have to know that there was also desegregation attempts as well with other ethnic groups as well. For example, such as like Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Latino Americans, right? All of these other groups did have their own form of like desegregating places, right? So, but for sure, definitely what happened in the South with Black Americans, I feel like that was like the main event of getting full desegregation for everybody who was not white, like Caucasian, So
Okay.
basically, Montgomery, Alabama would be like the place where everything would begin.
Okay.
So, I mean, and a lot of
Good to
people,
know.
and of course, probably like you may have forgotten, or maybe other people have forgotten, like how did this all come about? How is it that, the United States had these
Segregating
segregation laws,
laws.
like desegregation laws in the South, right? In which people always view the United States as a country for where people can be free, right? No matter what race,
I mean, it's united.
ethnicity.
Why is the South not as united as everyone else, like the North?
Well, we got to go back. Well, first of all, we got to go back a century before the civil rights movement took place. And by a century, I'm talking about the 1860s, which of course everyone should know in the early 1860s, a civil war happened. So the Union became divided into the northern states and the southern slave states, right? So basically, a war happened, and you have Abraham Lincoln, who was the president of the Union, who tried everything in his power to try to make sure the Union didn't break apart, right? And so after the Civil War ended, Abraham Lincoln passed a couple of laws, right?
Okay.
And those laws were basically the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were passed. So
13th Amendment is what?
So the 13th Amendment was basically the official abolition of slavery. The amendment abolished slavery for good.
Okay. Then we move to the 14th.
The 14th Amendment basically gave the rights for any person born in the United States. So any person that is born on American soil, whether it be the mainland, American bases, right? Those people are considered natural born citizens of the United States.
Okay.
Right.
And then the 15th Amendment is considered
the right of vote for everybody, for color, including colored people. So
people of color. Okay.
yeah, the 15th Amendment is the right to vote for anybody, regardless of what race they are.
Okay.
Minus women, mind you. This was the 1860s, so it was
Okay.
like minus women. But for sure, like any man can vote, right?
Okay.
The like for example, like the free
free
black,
people.
free black people, right? They were now allowed to vote. However, that did not go too well with the South. Unfortunately, it didn't go too well with the South, who basically started implementing their own codes known as black codes, right? They were strict local and state laws that detailed when, where, and how many formerly enslaved people could work and for how much compensation, right? So now the South is already putting laws like, okay, these free black people, we have the authority to decide where they can work, when, and for how much they can get, right? So
Sounds pretty stupid already.
right? And so pretty much put it this way, they ended up putting black citizens into indentured servitude. So they like to make the claim like, oh no, it's not slavery, they're working. They're getting paid for their work.
That's just another word of slavery, just because it's not, just because it's called indentured servitude. We're not even using the word slavery anymore. But we're just gonna code it into something else.
And they basically began taking their voting rights away. And to control, and they obviously controlled where they lived, right? And how they would travel into, they were allowed to take children for quote unquote labor purposes.
I was gonna say how they shipped them of their rights to vote, but I'm assuming just because of the way they set up the way they should work, how long they should be working, and when and where. I'm assuming it's just so they don't have any chance of going to the voting stations at that time to even use their voice.
And for a lot, and actually, the legal system in the South was so messed up towards black Americans because a lot of like the places, like the civil places, they had former Confederate soldiers working, like civil services, like policemen and judges.
Yikes.
So much for the 14th Amendment, right? Of like,
So much
because
for
there's a clause in the 14th Amendment that restricted those who were part of the rebellion against the Union, that they could not hold any public office, like
So you're
in
saying
government.
there's a clause in the 15th Amendment, the right to
14th, not 15th. He said 15th. It's the 14th Amendment.
Okay.
The 14th Amendment. There's the last clause that said anyone that was involved with, being part of the rebellion against the Union, it was like they couldn't hold public office. But unfortunately, the Union members didn't want to upset any more people, so they're like, okay, let's just put you back where you were before the war happened, etc. Right? So with these former Confederate soldiers working as police and judges, they ended up making it more difficult for black Americans to win court cases and ensuring they were making sure they were subject to the black codes that were posted right there.
Okay.
Right. So basically, it was a very grueling work, right? Because black offenders typically received longer sentences than their white equals, and because of the grueling work, often did not live out their entire like prison sentencing, right? So if a black, and of course, I think the 13th Amendment did gave clause to southern states who did imprisoned black people for crimes, right? Because in some prisons, like they are made to like break rocks for no reason, right? Just doing these manual labor. So of course, because of this, they used it as like a form of slavery at this point
Okay.
for black American inmates. You know,
Okay.
so of course, and then here comes basically
Yeah, another hurdle with.
another hurdle came with racist white supremacist groups against newly free black Americans, most notably the KKK, aka the Ku Klux Klan, aka the KKK. You all know what I'm talking about, right? It came out in 1865
Uh-huh.
in Pulaski, Tennessee. And it was known as a private club for Confederate veterans.
Uh-huh.
So basically, Confederate veterans had their own club.
Okay.
So the KKK would grow into the secret society that would terrorize black communities and seeping through white Southern culture with members at the highest levels of government and in the lowest echelons of criminal back alleys. So basically, the KKK was just like a ragtag group of like these individuals of Confederate veterans, right? That would terrorize black communities, right? Like at the dead of night, like right in the middle of the night, they would just find some farm of like a black American and take him outside and then do their dirty business and then not get punished for it, I guess, because of the leaders.
Tell me that it stopped there, at least with the KKK. Like, as far as the Jim Crow laws.
Yeah, so we haven't. So after the 1860s, because Ulysses S. Grant put a stop to it when he became president. He like did a crackdown on the KKK in the 1870s, and so that ceased to exist for a while. Like there wasn't like a whole lot of that activity, but obviously, at the start of the 1880s, big cities in the South were not wholly beholden to Jim Crow laws, and black Americans found more freedom in them. So there was like a difference between like the rural southern areas and in the cities. So in the rural areas, the Jim Crow laws were like in major effect, right? But if you go like to the cities, black Americans did sort of find more freedom in them, per se. But that doesn't mean there wasn't any segregation in the cities. But nonetheless, they had a little bit more freedom in the cities.
Okay.
So I mean, Jim Crow laws though would begin to spread around the country with even more force than previously, right? So public parks were forbidden for black Americans to enter, and of course theaters and restaurants, cafes, schools, they would all be segregated, right? And of course you have segregated waiting rooms in bus and train stations as well.
Okay.
And of course, the train cars were segregated as well. From water fountains, restrooms, building entrances, elevators, cemeteries, even amusement park cashier windows. Basically, Jim Crow laws made black Americans feel alienated from white Americans, from white society.
There's not one place you could go where you feel like you had to be put in a different area.
Basically, yeah. So everything that black Americans did were controlled by the government that would in most cases be mainly Caucasian, would be white.
Okay.
And they would obviously be descended from Civil War veterans. Like a lot of them were like descended from Civil War veterans and all this, and so they kept everything, the way it was supposed to be, right? And of course, interracial marriage was forbidden as well.
Forbidden, you say?
Interracial marriage was like illegal in southern states.
Okay. Interesting. Forbidden.
It was It was forbidden, and like so, living in the North was actually way better for Black Americans. Though, like
Hopefully.
it was like way better to live in the North, or like even in the West Coast than like the Southern states. Like for example, like California, like there was a
Uh-huh.
lot of blacks were more free in California. Yeah.
Okay.
So
I mean, so we talked about how, Jim Crow laws were in effect, how you're saying, when it was after the Civil War, the Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. So now, how is the North, or is the North responding to any of this? Well, is there any response from that besides Martin Luther King stepping in?
there should, I mean, there should have been, but after that, it was like because the abolitionists, right? Abolitionists were known as like the people who were against slavery, right? They wanted to end slavery in the United States before the Civil War and like during the Civil War, but after slavery ended, right, there was activities done by people, right, to get Black Americans like the rights they deserved, but it's like it wasn't really like spoken out a lot. Like it didn't get much attention
Okay.
as it did back then. So basically, all that attention would come down to during like the 1950s mainly. That's where everything happened. And a good example of that would be like the Brown versus Board of Education, which I'm sure if you remember that, or if you need a little like refresher on what that one was about.
Brown's Board of Education had something to do with education, right?
Yes, it has to do something with education.
um, I'm I'm thinking out a little bit, but it may have something to do with free education for all people in the U.S., even including people of color.
So you're on the right track. You're on the right track right there. You have a good answer. Put it more simply, it ended segregation of public schools. So it was a call to desegregate public schools, and it was done by Thurgood Marshall, who helped win the case.
Win the case
Yeah.
against Brown. This is Board of
Cool.
Education.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, that was like the first step, like desegregating schools, and that was just the beginning,
Uh-huh.
right? That was the beginning, which was the desegregation of the schools in 1954,
Okay.
and you had when that happened, you had people who, even like people, like white Southerners, who were going against it right away. They did not like it, especially what happened in Little Rock, Arkansas, where Little Rock, Arkansas, where the president of the United States had to call in the military to enforce a law,
The law of
like
Brown versus Board of Education.
to basically enforce it. And it was ever since the Civil War. Like the Reconstruction era, no president since after the Reconstruction era had to use the military to impose like the laws.
Okay.
And so President Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first president in like almost a century where he had to use the military to impose the laws right there in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Okay.
So yeah, and then you just go on from there, from like the Montgomery boycott,
To the Civil Rights Movement.
like the Civil Rights Movement, the March towards Washington, and basically, yeah. So the March towards Washington was basically this massive event that took place from people all over the United States, right? Whether they were black, white, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where they were from, but the March towards Washington happened in 1960, right?
Okay.
It happened in 1960, and They did this march on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which was a peaceful political rally designed to shed light on the injustices Black Americans continue to face across the country. Held on August 28th and attended by some 200,000 to 300,000 participants, the event is widely regarded as a watershed moment in the history of the American Civil Rights Movement and a factor in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Which I'm guessing is when that whole situation or the whole speech started with.
Exactly.
The dream.
And that was where his Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous speech, "I Have a Dream," came to play, right? And this event took place right on the steps in front of the Lincoln Memorial. I think, how ironic or how powerful, because of course every Black American in the country at the time knew about Abraham Lincoln. They all know Abraham Lincoln, right? It's like they view him as the person who
ended slavery.
Who basically ended slavery, right? He was the one who ended slavery, and a lot of Black Americans looked up to Abraham Lincoln, and actually a lot of Black Americans ended up being Republicans after emancipation. So
The good old Emancipation Proclamation.
So basically, standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, right, he shared his vision of a future in which this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So he was very educated, all right? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was very educated. He knows the Constitution. He knows the Declaration of Independence. He knows what the words are on these famous documents, right? And so the speech in March cemented King's reputation at home and abroad. Later that year, he was named Man of the Year by Time magazine, and in 1964 became, at the time, the youngest person ever awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
The Nobel Peace Prize.
I know he was awarded that, but I didn't know he was the youngest person to have received the prize. Which is insane.
I would have not known because I don't pay attention to age when someone wins the Nobel Peace Prize, so it's interesting to hear.
Yeah, so I mean, but that doesn't mean everything was over, right? Nothing changed right away. Like, in the southern states, like nothing changed. Like, well, yeah, we'll change it. We'll get rid of everything, right? How in the spring of 1965, King's elevated profile drew international attention to the violence that erupted between white segregationists and peaceful demonstrators in Selma, Alabama, where the SCLC and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, had organized a voter registration campaign. So again, same thing. Voter registration, voter rights, right? And captured on television, the brutal scene outraged many Americans and inspired supporters from across the country to gather in Alabama and take part in the Selma to Montgomery march led by King and supported by President Lyndon B. Johnson, who sent in federal troops to keep the peace. So again, you have another president that had to send in federal troops to keep the peace, which was President Johnson, right? And of course, in August of 1965, Congress would pass the Voting Rights Act, which guaranteed the right to vote, first awarded by the 15th Amendment. Not, mind you, this was, it's ridiculous how they had to pass another Voting Rights Act, even after an amendment was passed, 100 years ago. Like a century ago, and it was ridiculous. It's like now Congress had to pass the Voting Rights Act when it was already written on paper, right?
I mean, you have to make it clear for these people because sometimes, I mean, you already saw what was happening, with the Jim Crow laws. I feel like that's just needed clarification that we're guaranteeing everyone's right to vote.
And plus, it wasn't that. The reason why Black Americans weren't allowed to vote was because these white poll workers gave them literacy tests to see if literacy tests just to see if they can read and write and they know what they're doing. It's like, really? Seriously? And you literally had to wait a century to make another Voting Rights Act that was supposed to have been enforced when the 15th Amendment was passed a century before. It was just ridiculous. So Martin Luther King Jr. did believe in peaceful demonstration. No violence, nothing. Everything must be done peaceful. And one of his icons was actually Gandhi from India. Was actually Gandhi from India because the way how India was able to gain independence from Great Britain when they were still a colony of Great Britain was through peaceful protests, right? And Gandhi was able to accomplish that by doing peaceful protests and boycotting. India was able to get independence from Great Britain. Right. So that was why Martin Luther King Jr. used him as like an inspiration in like doing like the boycotts and like the peaceful protests over here in the United States to get the equal rights that Black Americans deserve.
It's good to know. So, what happened after that?
Well, Martin Luther King Jr. lived his life true to spreading his word to every American and even to the world about how important it is for civil rights to be given to all people, regardless of race, nationality, and of religion, right? But unfortunately, things didn't go well with him. There was some people didn't like the way he was doing things and trying to get these civil rights enforced. So basically the events in Selma, right, deepened a growing rift between Martin Luther King Jr. and young radicals who repudiated his non-violent methods and commitment to working within the established political work frame, right? As more militant black leaders such as Stokely Carmichael rose to prominence, King broadened the scope of his activism to address issues such as the Vietnam War, poverty among Americans of all races, and in 1967, King and the SCLC embarked on an ambitious program known as the Poor People's Campaign, which was to include a massive march on the Capitol.
Oh, okay.
So there was a rift. Technically, I'm trying my best not to sound as messed up as possible, or I don't know what people view of or is gonna view of me when I say that. But you know what? There was a lot of divisions between the between the Black American community, right? Because you have not only do you have Martin Luther King Jr., but you have another person by the name of Malcolm X, another prominent figure during the Civil Rights Movement. So the main difference, though, was that Malcolm X promoted violence to get what you wanted.
Okay.
That's like the main difference between the two of these men, of these brilliant men. Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to do everything by peaceful protest and demonstration, but Malcolm X was like, oh heck no, you better be violent, you better do violence in order to get what the heck you want. If you want voting rights, you better beat some people up or something, right? And then of course this leads to the group like the Black Panthers, right, who did use violence against people. So I mean,
that I didn't remember.
Yeah. So like, there was a lot of separation or like different views from like African Americans during that time period. So 1967, right? Vietnam was happening, and the thing about this is that the CIA accused Martin Luther King Jr. of being communist. Like the FBI and the CIA.
Because he wanted equality. And
Correct.
Communism is all about equal pay and how everyone deserves equality.
Right. It's like, because that's how white Southerners viewed it. Like, that's the reason why white Southerners view about equality, right? When they hear communism, it's like they think that giving equal rights to anyone who wasn't white, like, to be communist, right? But it's like, no, it's a common sense thing. It's a God-given right for everybody. God gave us all rights, no matter what race we are. And, it's just supposed to be common sense. But no, they're like, oh, if you want equality, you are a communist, blah, 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 blah. Like, okay, communism is an economic ideology, all right?
At least that's
Nothing.
what other people in other countries view communism as.
Yep. So there was that. He was
Uh-huh.
arrested a few times.
A few.
He was arrested a few times in which he would be jailed for like conspiracy and all these wild things, right?
Okay.
And so, he had a good life to live, but then unfortunately, on the evening of April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King's life would come to an end as he would be assassinated. So while he was standing on the balcony of a motel in Memphis, Tennessee, right? So he was there to. So he was basically traveling.
Wait, what is he doing in Memphis?
So he was traveling to support a sanitation workers strike. So of course, sanitation workers, right? They did a strike, right?
Okay.
But in the wake of his death, unfortunately, and this is the one thing that makes this country like
Not as united as.
well, not
people.
as united as everything, because on the wake of his assassination, a wave of riots swept through major cities across the country. And
I mean, you just
while-
killed someone that was
Someone
a
was
non-peace. Someone was killed, and he was not pro-violence.
Yeah, and even President Johnson declared a national day of mourning. It was like, this is a national day of mourning. Someone got assassinated, yes, someone got killed, but that doesn't mean you can go around the streets acting all wild and doing rioting things, right? Breaking into businesses, burning down homes, and obviously, they found the killer. His name was James Earl Ray, an escaped convict and known as a racist. He pleaded guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to 99 years in prison. But he later recanted his confession and gained some unlikely advocates, including members of the King family, before his death in 1998. So he would die in 1998. Eventually, the killer was in prison, and
So his death happens. Rest in peace. And what happens after that?
well, the push for making a federal holiday named after him. It literally took 15 years to make Martin Luther King Jr. Day a national holiday.
Okay.
It literally took 15 years. And it was because there's a lot of oppositions, obviously, from certain people, right? So, John Conyers, who was then a Democratic congressman from Michigan, took to the floor of Congress to insist on a federal holiday in King's honor. But unfortunately, the request fell on deaf ears, right? It was like saying, oh, well, we got more important things than to listen to this nonsense sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
And he was one of few black people. John Conyers was one of few black people in Congress, right? He's been an active member. He was an active member of the civil rights movement. He visited Selma, right? And he didn't want to stop, right? He didn't want to stop. He kept insisting the bill be passed, right? After the first bill passed, he was undaunted, and historian Don Wolfensberger says, year after year, Congress after Congress, and introducing the same bill again and again, gathering co-sponsors along the way until his persistence finally paid off, right? So year after year, he brought this bill to the floor, right? And the tide would finally turn in the early 1980s, right? And by that time, the CBC, which is the Congressional Black Caucus, they had collected 6 million signatures in support of the federal holiday in honor of King, right? And basically, in 1983, as civil rights movement veterans gathered in Washington to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington, King's seminal "I Have a Dream" speech in the 15th anniversary of his murder, something shook loose, right? So basically, because of that anniversary, the legislation took more into like paying attention, right? And when the legislation once again made it to the floor, it was filibustered by Jesse Helms, the Republican senator from North Carolina, right? And Helms, being like a southerner, right, that he is, he wanted to introduce FBI smear material on King. He's like, well, we can't do this because look at all this material that the FBI had about this, right? They're pinpointing him as a communist. He's a threat to the United States, right? So basically, he wanted to do that, right? But however, Patrick Monahan, who was a senator from New York, like the materials was brought to the floor, but then he dropped them to the ground in disgust in a pivotal moment of the debate. So he was like, screw this. He was like, you know what? Screw your paper. Screw this. This is false. They had nothing to do with it. This was not good. But so basically the vote happened. And in a 78-22 vote, President Ronald Reagan immediately signed the legislation.
Okay.
But the first time that the holiday was celebrated was in 1986. That was the first time it would be celebrated, 1986. But it took years to make it be as an observance to every state. And basically, Arizona initially observed the holiday, then rescinded it, leading to a years-long scuffle over where to celebrate King that ended in multiple public referenda, major boycotts of the state, and a final voter registration push that helped people a final referendum towards success in 1992. However, you get this, and of course we were born already, it wasn't until 2000 when every state in the United States observed Martin Luther King Jr.
Or so they say. Or so they say. I mean, there's some companies, I would say, all over this U.S., not every company, but obviously there are those few that have people still come in during Martin Luther King Day, even though it's supposed to be observed as a federal holiday.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Well, I guess federal, given federal being government
anything
holiday.
Government. Well,
So
anything federal holidays means government.
Doesn't include
really means government.
Doesn't include non-government entities. I guess. Okay.
Basically, it means non-government. Like for example, like Sederberg's isn't closed. Walmart's not closed. Cardenas isn't closed.
Yes, but I mean, I understand the point. I understand the point that's being made that he tried to make it so that every state has to observe this federal holiday, regardless of their own thoughts and opinions about MLK.
Exactly. So but the thing is, the one thing I want to point out is, this was terrible. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. was a terrible, terrible moment in U.S. history, right? But just the fact that people would go out and riot because of this.
I mean, he was probably the glue that was keeping them all together from going into violence. So the fact that they're one and only person that doesn't tell them to do things non-violently or violently, is gone. There's nothing stopping them at this point.
Yeah, but unfortunately, something happened. Some things happened because of in recent years, like 2020, COVID years, where something like this happened because of, unfortunately, a death of a certain individual, and people just end up rioting, looting things, looting livelihoods of people that have built things from the ground up, and they end up getting looted or destroyed, and because of this one thing, it's like, no, that is not the answer to everything like that. This is not the way it's supposed to go. You're angry, but that doesn't mean you go around and do rioting stuff. You loot businesses, you beat up people. So
I mean, okay, so now it's a federal holiday. Do you think we are keeping up with honoring his legacy now, present day?
I believe we are. I believe we're keeping up with his legacy, right? Not to not not fully, right? But we are in some ways. Yes, we here as Americans are fulfilling his legacy, right? Where there's no more segregations, right? I mean, man, maybe
I mean, most
one or
companies
few.
say they're
Maybe,
equal opportunity employers, so I would say
But
yeah,
like,
that's probably
but I mean,
for the most
there
part.
is
Yeah.
for the most part, there's no segregation, right? Which is a good thing. Voters can vote, right? And you know, yeah, we are keeping true to his legacy, but it's just those few bad apples where it's like, you know, they just take things too far, like throwing a riot.
I guess. Well, that concludes our talk show for today for Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you guys for listening and joining us as we talked about, you know, the legacy of Martin Luther King. For our next episode, we will be diving into the month of February, which is the year, not the year, sorry, the month of love and amour, especially with Valentine's Day coming.
L'amor.
Do we consider Valentine's Day something of religious significance, or do you feel like it's going to be considered something of worldly obsession? That is what you'll be hearing from us next time. So make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know what you liked about this podcast and any questions that you might have in regards to Martin Luther King or stuff that we
Anything else?
talked about during this episode.
Or anything else, really. If you have a request of what you'd like for us to talk about, right, please. We'd like to hear from you all of like what you guys want to hear. If there are any burning questions of like anything in history that you want us to try to get more down into, like try to help us understand, like get you to understand as much as possible, then please use the comment section to please.
Also, thank you to those that have commented already on the videos. We appreciate that, and we do read those when we get the chance to. So we appreciate your feedback from the videos. Thank you guys for joining. Thank you for bringing and supplying the wine today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I think I should save the wine for our Valentine's Day talk. We'll probably do another.
We'll probably figure something else. We'll probably figure something else out for that day. Maybe a different drink. Who knows? We'll see what happens when that day comes. So thank you guys for joining us as we take a drink with the past.